There are stories that people whisper only when the lights are off, stories that never make it into books or news reports, because no one truly wants to believe them. They travel quietly from one frightened voice to another, carried through generations by those who swore they saw something they could never explain. This is one of those stories, and it begins in a small, forgotten town where the streets are always damp with rain, and the fog rolls in so thick that even daylight feels uncertain. The houses there are old and tired, their wooden frames creaking like they are whispering to each other, and the air always carries the faint scent of rust and wet soil. In this lonely town lived a young girl named Emily, curious, gentle, and endlessly drawn to things that seemed to hold secrets. She was the kind of child who found beauty in broken things. She collected forgotten trinkets from the past and loved to imagine the lives that once surrounded them. Her mother often told her to stop bringing home strange objects, but Emily couldn't help it. There was something inside her that wanted to uncover what others left behind. She never knew that one day her curiosity would lead her to something that wasn't meant to be found. It happened on a grey afternoon when the sky looked heavy with rain and the air felt thick with the promise of a storm. Emily wandered down an alley she had never seen before, its walls lined with old shops and fading signs that swayed gently in the wind. The sound of her footsteps echoed softly on the wet cobblestones until she stopped before a tiny antique store, its windows fogged with age, the glass so dirty that she could barely see inside. Yet something about it pulled her closer. The faint flicker of a light, the outline of shapes she couldn't quite recognize, and deep inside the stillness she thought she saw a face watching her. The bell above the door jingled weakly when she stepped in. The smell of dust and old paper filled her lungs. Every shelf was crowded with relics from forgotten lives, faded photographs, clocks that had stopped ticking, mirrors that reflected shadows that didn't belong. And then she saw it sitting quietly on there. Frozen, the world around her fading into silence. She didn't know why, but she felt like the doll had been waiting for her, waiting for someone to see it. That was the moment everything changed. From the instant Emily laid eyes on that doll, her life began to twist into something far darker than she could ever. "This is the story of the doll that wouldn't stay still," you said. The rain fell softly that afternoon, creating a rhythm against the cobblestones. As Emily wandered through the narrow alley she loved, exploring forgotten corners of the city, places that felt untouched by time, there was something about the quiet and the decay that fascinated her. The broken signs, the smell of old wood, the faint echo of stories lost in the air. Each step she took seemed to pull her deeper into another world. And then she saw it, a small antique store tucked between two crumbling buildings. Its windows fogged, its door slightly open, as if inviting her in. The moment she stepped inside, the sound of a small bell rang through the air, but it was dull, like even the sound was tired. The air smelled of dust and age, and everywhere she looked were objects that seemed to hold memories. A cracked mirror leaning against the wall, faded photographs of people who no longer existed, rusted clocks frozen at different hours, and rows of dolls all lined up with glass eyes that reflected the dim light of the shop. It felt like a place that had stopped breathing long ago, yet somehow still lived in silence. And then she saw it, the doll. It sat high on the shelf, hidden beneath a thin sheet of cobwebs, its white dress yellowed by time, its porcelain skin smooth and pale, her eyes deep blue, like the sea just before a storm. There was something unsettling about those eyes. They didn't look painted. They looked aware, as if they were quietly observing everything in the room. Emily felt her chest tighten, but she couldn't look away. She felt drawn to it in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was fascination, mixed with something deeper, something that whispered her name in the back of her mind. She reached up on her toes, stretching her arm to touch it, and the moment her fingers brushed the cold porcelain, a chill ran through her skin, sharp and electric. It made her shiver, but she didn't pull away. It felt almost alive, like there was a pulse beneath the glass surface. For a second she could have sworn she felt it breathe. The air around her grew heavier. The light flickered, the faint ticking of the clocks in the shop stopped for just a heartbeat, and in that stillness she thought she saw the doll blink. But when she looked again, it was still. A voice broke the silence. The shopkeeper. An old man with tired eyes and hands that trembled slightly stepped forward. He looked at the doll, then at Emily, and shook his head slowly. He spoke in a low voice that carried both warning and regret. "That one is not for sale," he said. His voice cracked at the edges as if repeating something he had said too many times before. Emily looked at him confused, but the old man didn't meet her gaze. Instead, he stared at the doll as though afraid of what might happen if he looked too long. Her mother called from the doorway, impatient and distracted, brushing off the tension in the room. With a casual laugh, Emily begged softly, just one more look, just one more moment with it. But her mother sighed, pulled out her wallet, and bought it anyway as they stepped outside. The wind picked up, suddenly fierce and cold. Emily hugged the doll close to her chest, its porcelain face pressing against her arm, and for a heartbeat, she thought she felt it move, not a lot, just enough to make her heart skip. She looked down quickly, but the doll was still, its head tilted slightly as though it was smiling at her. A quiet, gentle smile that didn't feel quite right that first night. The rain outside never seemed to stop it, whispered against the glass as Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound feel louder, every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind. She could still remember the moment she placed the doll on her shelf, its glassy blue eyes catching the dim light of her bedside lamp. For some reason she could not bring herself to turn the doll away from her. It felt wrong to have its back turned, so she let it sit facing her, as if it were keeping her company. The clock on her nightstand ticked steadily, marking the hours, but sleep refused to come. Her room felt colder than usual, even with the windows closed. A faint chill brushed over her arms like someone exhaling against her skin. She pulled the blanket tighter and tried to convince herself that she was imagining it, but deep inside she knew the air had changed. There was something different, something awake, something aware. Then she heard it. A soft sound, like a faint tap, from somewhere near the door. She held her breath. It came again, but slower this time, as though tiny feet were crossing the wooden floor. She told herself, it must be the house settling, but the sound grew closer, until it stopped near her bed. Her eyes darted to the shelf. The doll was no longer sitting where she had left it. Her heart started to race. Maybe she had moved it without remembering. Maybe it fell. Maybe her mind was just playing tricks on her. She reached for the lamp and turned it on. The light flickered once before glowing steady, and when her eyes adjusted, her breath caught in her throat. The doll was sitting on the windowsill, its little porcelain hands resting perfectly still, its head slightly tilted as though watching the rain outside. Emily froze, unable to move or speak. The window was closed and locked. She knew she hadn't touched the doll since placing it on the shelf earlier that evening. She tried to tell herself that her mother must have come in and moved it, but that thought didn't bring comfort. It made her feel smaller somehow, like she was no longer in control of what happened in her own room. The next morning, her mother laughed when Emily told her what she saw. She said she must have dreamed it. But the unease didn't fade. The day felt long. The house, unusually quiet, shadows seemed to stretch just a little further, and whenever Emily walked into her room, she could swear the doll was never quite in the same position as before. Sometimes it sat on the shelf, sometimes on the desk, and once she found it lying on her pillow, as if it had been waiting for her to come back that night. The rain returned, and so did the sounds. Faint whispers, soft and rhythmic, echoing through the walls. She sat up in bed, staring at the doll, now resting once again on the shelf. Her chest rose and fell too fast, her heart beating in her throat. For a moment she thought she saw its head move just slightly toward her, and in the dim light she could have sworn its painted smile looked wider than before. The next few nights grew heavier with silence, the kind of silence that felt alive. Emily tried to tell herself that she was imagining things, that the doll hadn't moved on its own. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Every morning she would wake to find it in a different place, sometimes sitting neatly on the edge of her desk, sometimes near the door, and once even on the staircase, as if it had been trying to leave, or maybe waiting for someone to notice its little journeys through the dark hallways. She started to keep track, marking where she left it before going to bed every night. She would place the doll carefully on the same spot on the shelf, facing the window, its pale porcelain face bathed in the faint glow. Of moonlight she made sure to remember its position, the tilt of its head, the way its tiny hands rested against its dress, and every morning it was different. Once its head was turned toward her bed, another time it was sitting at the foot of her blanket, looking straight at her with those painted eyes that no longer felt painted at all. Her mother dismissed it at first, said that maybe the vibrations from the passing train made it fall or shift slightly. Emily wanted to believe her, but there were no signs of it falling, no broken pieces, no noise, nothing. Each time the doll sat perfectly still, perfectly balanced, like someone had placed it there with care. She began to feel watched in her own room when she did her homework. She could feel those glass eyes on her. When she changed clothes, she turned the doll to face the wall, but later it would always be facing her again. The nights grew colder, even when the weather outside was warm, and the shadows seemed to cling to the corners of her room. She tried locking the doll in her wardrobe one night just to feel safe for a while. She closed the door tightly and pushed a chair in front of it. The creak of the hinges echoed as though the wardrobe itself sighed. In relief, she slept that night for the first time in days, or at least she thought she did, until the middle of the night, when the sound came back, the faint scraping of porcelain against wood. Slow, deliberate, steady, she sat up, trembling, staring at the wardrobe door that began to rattle gently as if something inside wanted to come out. Her breathing quickened. She tried to call for her mother, but no sound came out. She grabbed her blanket and held it tightly over her face until the sounds stopped. The house went still again, and for a long moment she believed maybe she had dreamed it. But when she finally gathered the courage to open the wardrobe the next morning, her stomach twisted. The doll was gone from the shelf. It was sitting right on her desk chair, its small porcelain hand resting on her open notebook, and across the first page, written in faint smudges of dust, was a single word: hello. Emily began to talk to the doll without even realizing it. At first, it started as small whispers, things she said out of habit when she was alone in her room. She would look up from her homework and say, "You look pretty today," or "Do you like my dress?" and then laugh quietly to herself. It felt harmless at the beginning, just a silly game to chase away the unease, but after a few days, her whispers turned into conversations, long ones that stretched into the night when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep. She sat cross-legged on her bed and spoke softly to the doll, as if it could really hear her, and somehow it began to feel like it did. There was something in the air that changed whenever she spoke to it, a heaviness that wasn't exactly frightening, but strange, like the room was holding its breath, listening to every word she said. She told the doll about school, about her friends, about her dreams and her fears, and somewhere between those late-night talks, she began to hear faint replies. Not clear words, just sounds like the soft hum of a sigh, the brush of porcelain against the wood of the shelf, and once a small giggle that echoed. So faintly she thought it might have come from inside her own head, but it didn't stop. Her mother started to notice her daughter's new habit. She would find Emily sitting quietly in her room, lips moving in a soft rhythm, her eyes unfocused, as if she were lost in a trance when asked who she was talking to. Emily would always smile faintly and say, "Annette likes when I tell her stories," her voice always calm but her eyes different, as if a thin veil had settled over them. Her mother brushed it off, thinking it was just a phase, but soon it wasn't just whispers anymore. Emily began using words that no one in the family had ever said, words that felt old, almost ancient. Once, while setting the table, she muttered something under her breath that made her mother pause. It was a name, maybe, or a sound that didn't belong to any language she knew, and when she asked Emily what she said, the girl looked confused for a moment, as if she hadn't realized she had spoken at all, then smiled and said, "Annette taught me that at night the conversations grew longer." Emily would sit in the dark with the doll on her lap, her fingers tracing its cracked porcelain skin. The air would feel colder in that part of the house, and sometimes her mother could hear faint murmuring from behind the closed door. When she pressed her ear against it, there were two voices, one soft and young, and the other faint, like the echo of something not quite human. She tried to open the door once, but found it locked from the inside, and when Emily finally came out in the morning, she looked pale, her eyes shadowed. but always smiling, always saying that Annette had told her another story. The house began to feel different. 2. Objects seemed to move slightly. The air carried a strange stillness, as if something unseen was listening. Emily started leaving food on her desk for the doll. Small crumbs of bread, tiny pieces of fruit, and when her mother tried to throw them away, Emily became furious, her voice trembling with something that didn't sound like her own. She screamed, "Annette doesn't like that," before covering her mouth as though she had said something she shouldn't, and from that night on her mother never tried to interfere again. The fear in the house grew heavier with every passing night, and her parents finally decided they had to get rid of the doll. It had become more than a strange toy. It felt like a presence that was slowly consuming their daughter. They waited until Emily was at school before they crept into her room. Her mother hesitated for a moment, staring at the doll sitting neatly on the shelf, its blue eyes gleaming faintly in the dim light. Her father didn't wait. He grabbed it quickly, wrapping it in an old cloth. But the moment he touched it, the air seemed to drop in temperature. A shiver passed through him. But he shook it off, telling himself it was nothing. They drove to the edge of town near the river, where the old bridge stood, and without saying a word, her father threw the doll into the dark, moving water. It sank fast, vanishing beneath the surface. Her mother exhaled slowly, as though she had been holding her breath for hours. The house felt lighter when they returned, almost peaceful that evening. For the first time in weeks, they laughed at dinner, and Emily seemed quiet but calm. When she asked where Annette was, her parents told her gently that the doll had been lost. Emily just stared at them, her face blank, her voice low and distant. When she said she would find her again that night, Emily didn't sleep. She sat up in bed, her small hands gripping the blanket. The house creaked under the weight of silence. The clock ticked loudly in the hall, and then there was a faint dripping sound coming from outside the window. She got up slowly and pulled the curtain aside. The rain hadn't started yet, but the window pane was wet, slick trails of water sliding down, as if something had just climbed through the night air. Her breath fogged the glass, and when she wiped it away, her heart stopped. The doll was sitting on the windowsill, soaked from head to toe, its golden curls dark with water. Its eyes fixed on her scream brought her parents running. They found her shaking, pointing at the window. But when they looked, there was nothing there. The window was dry and empty. Her father searched the room, but there was no sign of the doll. He tried to comfort her, telling her it was a bad dream, but deep down, he knew she hadn't been dreaming. The smell of river water still lingered faint and cold in the air later that night. When they went back to their room, her mother froze. The doll was sitting on her dresser, its face cracked slightly from where it had hit the water. Its smile still perfect. The next day, they tried again. This time they burned it in the backyard. Her father poured kerosene over it and set it on fire. The flames rose high, twisting and spitting. The smell of burning paint and old fabric filled the air. Emily stood at the window, watching silently, her reflection flickering in the glass. The flames seemed to fight the wind, but eventually the fire burned down to ashes. When her father checked the remains, there was nothing left, only a faint outline of where it had been, and for a few hours they felt free. They thought it was finally over, but the following morning her mother woke up to a noise in the kitchen, the clinking of porcelain against the table. She walked in half asleep, and there it was, sitting in the middle of the table, its dress perfectly clean, not a single burn, Market's blue eyes glinting in the early light, as if mocking them. Her scream woke the whole house, and Emily ran down the stairs, smiling softly, saying in a quiet voice, "I told you she doesn't like to be left." The days after that became a blur of fear and confusion. Emily was no longer the same. Her laughter had turned hollow, and her voice carried a strange calm that felt wrong. Her parents watched helplessly as their little girl faded into something they couldn't understand. She stopped eating, stopped going outside, and spent most of her time sitting on the floor of her room with the doll in her lap, whispering in a voice too soft to make out. When her mother tried to listen, she would catch fragments of sentences that didn't sound like English words, that were sharp and strange, carrying an echo that didn't belong in a child's throat. The doll itself began to change, small, at first almost unnoticeable. Its once bright blue eyes grew darker, like something had seeped inside, staining the glass from within. Its porcelain skin, which used to shine softly in the light, now looked dull, with thin hairline cracks spreading across the face, as if something beneath was trying to break free. But it wasn't just the doll that was changing. Emily's face began to mirror it. her skin pale, her lips losing their color, her eyes distant and glassy like she wasn't entirely there anymore. Her parents took her to doctors, but no one could explain what was happening. They said maybe it was trauma, maybe stress, but nothing helped. She wouldn't sleep unless the doll was in her arms, and if anyone tried to take it away, she would scream until her throat went raw. One night, her mother woke up to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. When she looked through the crack of Emily's door, she froze. Emily was sitting in the middle of the floor with a doll in front of her, both of them facing each other, perfectly still, the moonlight spilling across their faces. It was hard to tell which one was breathing. Her mother tried to call her name, but the words died in her throat. The air felt thick and wrong. Then Emily's head turned slowly, her eyes reflecting the moonlight in an unnatural gleam. She smiled and said, in a calm, quiet voice, "Annette says she doesn't like you watching her after that." Her mother never tried again. She started locking her own door at night. The next morning, Emily didn't come down for breakfast. Her father went to check on her and found her room colder than the rest of the house. The windows shut, the curtains drawn, and yet the air felt icy. Emily sat in her chair facing the wall, humming a slow tune, the doll sitting on her lap. Their heads tilted at the same exact angle. He tried to touch her shoulder, but she jerked away without turning around, and in a voice that wasn't quite hers, she said, "She's teaching me to stay forever." Every night after that, the whispers grew louder, sometimes coming from Emily's room, sometimes from the hallway, and sometimes from places no one could see. The sound of two voices, one childlike and one faint like the echo of breath through glass. Sometimes they heard laughter, soft, but sharp enough to make their blood run cold. Emily stopped responding to her parents. Completely, she moved through the house like someone walking in a dream, slow, deliberate. Her eyes always empty, but her lips always carrying that same small smile that looked too much like the one painted on the doll that final night. Began with a silence that felt heavier than usual, the kind that seemed to press against the walls of the house until every creak sounded like a warning. Emily had barely spoken all day. Her skin was pale as wax, and her eyes had grown darker, almost hollow. She spent hours in her room, the door locked, the faint sound of whispering slipping through the cracks. Her parents stood outside, more than once, trying to listen. But all they could hear was the rhythmic murmur of two voices, one soft, one distant, both rising and falling like waves in the dark. They knocked again and again, but she never answered. Later that night, the power went out without warning. The lights flickered once before the house fell into darkness. The only sound was the slow ticking of the clock in the hall. Her father grabbed a flashlight and made his way toward Emily's room, calling her name, but each time he said it, the house seemed to swallow the sound. He reached her door and tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't turn. It was cold to the touch, colder than metal should ever be. He pushed harder. The door creaked open, and the beam of the flashlight cut through the dark, revealing the room that no longer felt like his daughter's. The air inside was freezing. A thin mist seemed to cling to the floor. The walls were covered with faint handprints, small and perfect, as if made of dust or ash. And in the middle of the room sat Emily, her back to the door. Her hair tangled, her head tilted slightly to one side. The doll sat in front of her, facing her. Their knees almost touching. The flashlight trembled in his hand as he called her name again and again, but she didn't move, didn't even blink. Her mother stepped in behind him, whispering in fear, and then Emily spoke, her voice flat and calm. She said, "Annette says it's time now, before they could move the dolls." Head turned slowly toward them, the sound of cracking porcelain echoing in the stillness. Its painted lips seemed to curl into a faint smile, and the flashlight flickered again for a second, plunging the room into darkness. When the light came back on, Emily was standing, the doll still in her hands, her eyes completely empty. She whispered something under her breath, a word that made the air vibrate low and deep. The curtains moved, though the windows were shut. The shadows stretched across the floor as if they were alive. Her mother screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the dark. The flashlight hit the ground, rolling in circles, casting quick flashes across the room. In one of those flashes, Emily was right in front of them, her expression blank, her lips moving, but no sound coming out. Her father tried to grab her, but she slipped from his grasp with unnatural strength. The doll fell to the floor but didn't break. It landed gently upright, its eyes catching the beam of light, reflecting a deep red glow as though something inside it pulsed for a heartbeat. The wind began to howl outside, rattling the windows. Though the sky was still and starless, the house groaned under the weight of something unseen. The whispers grew louder now, surrounding them, coming from everywhere. Emily's voice, mixing with the doll's echo, one high, one low, both chanting the same name over and over again. The parents backed away helpless as the door slammed shut behind them, leaving the room sealed in darkness. Only the sound of laughter followed them down the hall, the laughter of a child, and the faint, brittle giggle of porcelain when the police arrived. The house was eerily quiet. The rain had stopped, and a thick fog hung low over the yard. The officers pushed open the front door and stepped into the dark hallway, their flashlights cutting through the dust that drifted in the air. The entire place smelled of something faintly sweet, like old perfume mixed with rot. The living room was untouched. A family photo still hung crooked on the wall, but there was no sign of movement, no sound except for the slow creaking of the floorboards under their boots. They called out for anyone to answer, but the only reply was the hollow echo of their own voices. Upstairs they found Emily's room. The door was half open, swaying slightly, as though it had just been touched. One of the officers stepped inside the beam of his flashlight, sweeping across the room. The first thing he noticed was the cold. It was so cold that their breath fogged instantly, and the air felt damp, like they had stepped into the bottom of a cave. The bed was neatly made, the window shut tight, the curtains drawn. But in the middle of the room there was a small chair, and sitting in it perfectly still was the doll, its pale face turned toward the window as if it had been waiting for someone to arrive. They called Emily's name, but there was no response. Her mother and father were gone too. No signs of a struggle, no footprints, no blood, just emptiness. One of the officers bent closer to the doll, studying its cracked porcelain face, its eyes a dull blue that seemed deeper than paint, as though something looked back from behind them. He reached out hesitantly, and the instant his fingers brushed its hand, a sharp chill shot up his arm, making him pull away. With a curse, his partner laughed nervously, saying it was just a toy. But neither of them could shake the feeling that the doll's head had moved just slightly. As they turned away, the search went on for hours. They checked every room, every closet, every corner, but found nothing. It was as if the entire family had vanished into the air. Only Emily's room remained strange, untouched, the doll sitting exactly where it had been when they first entered by dawn. The fog outside began to thin, and they left, promising to return with more people. But when they came back later that afternoon, something was different. The chair in the middle of the room was empty. The doll was gone for weeks. No one lived in that house. The neighbors said they could hear sounds at night, faint tapping noises coming from upstairs, and sometimes the soft melody of a child humming near the window. A new family eventually moved in months later. Unaware of the story, they cleaned the rooms, repainted the walls, tried to make it feel like home. But on the third day, the youngest daughter found something in her closet, wrapped carefully in an old piece of cloth. She unwrapped it slowly, her small hands trembling as she revealed a porcelain doll with golden curls and deep blue eyes, its cracked smile frozen in place. She carried it to her mother and asked, "Can I keep her? She was sitting on my bed when I woke up." Days turned into weeks, and the house where Emily once lived became a place no one dared to enter. The curtains were always drawn, the windows clouded with dust, and the garden that once bloomed with wildflowers grew over with thorns and weeds. The neighbors whispered that strange things happened at night. The faint creak of footsteps moving slowly across the upstairs hallway, the quiet sound of a child's giggle echoing from somewhere deep within the walls, sometimes a soft thud, as if something heavy had fallen, then silence again, heavy and waiting. People said that when you walked by the house after dark, you could feel it watching you, the way the air would suddenly grow cold, the way the lights from the street would flicker for just a second, as if something unseen had brushed past them. Over time, the story of Emily and the doll became a local legend. Children dared each other to touch the front gate at midnight, though none ever made it past the first step. They said if you stared too long into the dark windows, you could see her standing there, a faint figure with long hair, holding something small in her arms. Sometimes they said she would wave, sometimes she would just stare motionless, like the porcelain face of the doll itself. Years passed, and the town changed. The old alleyways were rebuilt. The antique shop, where Emily found the doll, was replaced by a bright cafe with golden lights and cheerful music. No one remembered the old man who once stood behind the counter warning people about what should not be touched yet. Sometimes late at night, when the rain came heavy and the streets grew empty, the people who worked there swore they could still hear a faint jingling sound like a tiny bell ringing somewhere in the distance, a sound that didn't belong to anything in the shop. And whenever they turned to look, there was nothing there. Only the faint impression of small footprints in the dust near the back room. One day, decades later, a moving company arrived to clear out Emily's old home. The new owners wanted to renovate, start fresh, tear away the old wood and memories that clung to the walls like cobwebs. The workers joked nervously about the ghost stories as they packed away furniture and boxes, but when one of them went upstairs to check the attic, he found something strange. Sitting in the center of the floor was a small wooden box covered in dust and tied with a faded ribbon. Inside, wrapped in an old piece of lace, was a porcelain doll, her golden curls still perfect, her blue eyes shining faintly, even in the dim light. He lifted the doll carefully, and for just a moment, he thought he saw its head tilt ever so slightly, as if acknowledging him, and though he laughed it off, a chill ran down his spine. He set it aside and went back to work. But when he returned a few minutes later, the box was empty, and the doll was gone that night. As he drove home through the rain, his headlights flickered, and for a brief second in the mirror, he thought he saw something in the back seat, a small figure sitting perfectly still, her head tilted, her blue eyes catching the reflection of the lights. He blinked, and she was gone, but the faint smell of old perfume lingered in the air, like a memory that refused to fade. And so the story continues, whispered quietly from one voice to another, a story that refuses to rest, just like the thing it speaks of. Because some objects remember, and some things, no matter how long you try to forget them, simply will not stay still.